Her hand hovered over the clipboard as if it might explode into something she couldn't catch. The pen felt foreign between long, nervous fingers. The paper beneath it smelled faintly of chalk dust from the waiting room brochure rack and the antiseptic that never quite left the air. Sophie Bennett stared at the neat, impersonal boxes: name, date of birth, reason for visit, and the room moved in slow, forgiving circles around her. A woman flipping a magazine 3 chairs down, a child asking for another grape, the receptionist tapping a keyboard. None of it fixed the way her pulse climbed whenever a door opened. "Miss Bennett?" The voice was polite, clipped with the efficiency of a place built on schedules. It folded the syllables of her name into a space that felt like a summons. She stood on wobbly legs, the lightness in her head translating into a dangerous kind of focus. The corridor into the exam room seemed longer than the hallway out from her flat. The clipboard made a soft thud against her palm as she followed the nurse who had smiled once, quickly, professional warmth, and then closed her mouth against the impulse to ask questions. He was framed for a second in the doorway when she stepped in, tall, not gaunt, but lithe in a way that spoke of late nights and manicured habits, dark hair, an apron of quiet over his shoulders, an expression practiced into being by hundreds of patients a week, attentive, unreadable. She noticed everything at once, like someone holding a magnifying glass too close to a small insect. The crease at the corner of his mouth when he read the chart, the precise angle of his chin, the faint smell of something expensive and cedar that didn't belong in a place that smelled of rubbing alcohol. His white coat didn't shout, it whispered competence. "Miss Bennett," he said, softer now, and she felt the world tilt. "I'm Dr. Hayes. How are you feeling today?" The question lodged in her throat. Her answers had been laminated through a lifetime of restraining the small catastrophes, anxiety, dizziness, the way her mouth would go dry at the sight of eyes like his. She wanted to say, "I am terrified. I have been avoiding this for years. I am a woman who sells second-hand books for a living, and I am embarrassed to take up your time." Instead, she said, "Fine," and heard the tiny crack in the word like a dropped plate. He smiled, trained and small. "Good. We'll just talk a little first. Tell me why you're here." Sophie found words by scanning, by listing, arriving in a safe clinical order. Irregular periods, pelvic pain, a family history she kept minimized because it sounded like begging. When she spoke, they were small, factual, the way people who are afraid of being too much lean toward the practical. He listened, hands folded, his pen tapping in a rhythm that matched the tremor she could feel at the base of her skull.
When he explained the steps, his voice had a cadence that unspooled a string of trust without meaning to. Measured, calm, professional. There was an art to being present and not intrusive, a discipline he had learned early in his career. Daniel Hayes had mastered it with clinic hours that began before sunrise and ended when the city was quiet. He was known for an efficiency that bordered on surgical, for the way he could make the most anxious patients feel, if not safe, then at least contained. He had learned to read tiny things, how a patient's foot tapped, the way shoulders tightened when certain words came up. That morning, Sophie's hands were an open book. He never once let his eyes travel to places they shouldn't. He kept the conversation to symptoms, to dates, to practical next steps. Yet there was curiosity in him that went beyond the clinical. He had noticed the way she thumbed a frayed page corner of a small paperback in the waiting room, how she smelled faintly of book glue and lemon soap. Little details like that lodged in him the way a photograph does, clear, small, impossible to ignore. The exam itself was brisk. Daniel explained what would happen, step by step, in language that had patience built into it. Sophie blinked and focused, practiced the breathing she had learned from an app, and replied in clipped sentences. The clinical lights felt harsh, yet in the midst of it all, she registered how careful he was with words. "Tell me if anything is uncomfortable," he said. "I'll stop." When it was over, she left with a prescription and a future appointment tucked into the calendar app on her phone. She walked out of the clinic with the warm, hollow kind of relief that follows a small victory, the kind you feel when you pass a test you studied for at 3 in the morning. On the pavement outside, the sun felt like someone else's weather. Her palms still smelled faintly of antiseptic, and for the rest of the morning her mind returned to the way he had said her name. It would not be the last time that name called her across a room. He watched her go and rubbed his thumb across the corner of the tablet he'd used to note her file. Patients came and went. He had trained himself to keep personal threads from knotting into the clinical fabric of his day. He had an entire system for staying detached enough to make the right decisions. Familial concern translated into data, loneliness treated with the same neutral tools as pain. When he reviewed her notes a week later, something that wasn't strictly medicinal tugged at him, an image, her fingers, the frayed paperback. Life outside the clinic slid into him quickly, a list of surgeries and consultations. He had lived long enough to know the danger of infatuation that did not belong to him. Daniel had seen how quickly something private could be turned into gossip, how power in a white coat could become a weapon in the wrong hands.
He had loved once, and it had been painful, the way a cracked bone aches when the weather changes. She had cared too much for his bank statements rather than his heart. That memory sat in him like a cautionary stone. Which is why he did what he did in the next days. Nothing dramatic. He left her alone. Let her be. But chance kept working in small increments. 2 mornings later, she brushed past him at the cafe across from the clinic. He drank black coffee from a paper cup, shoe scuffed, shirt collar open under a navy coat. She recognized the line of his jaw before she recognized the name of the clinic printed on his badge. He looked up from a book, medical journals aside. He read novels under stress the way people smoke, caught her face, and offered a small, civilized nod. She did not know what to do with a nod. She squeezed his eyes shut, and for a half-second, practiced vanishing. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and sugar, sunlight slanting across the table where he sat. Daniel noticed the way she paused by the pastry counter, as if choosing whether to spend $2 on a croissant would decide her fiscal future. He watched her tuck a strand of hair into the collar of her coat, the same motion she made in the exam room. He made a decision that surprised him by its simplicity. When the line thinned, he ordered the croissant and asked the barista to put it aside. He didn't want to startle her. He wanted to be a quiet presence, not a spectacle. It should have been nothing, another small, anonymous kindness he doled out more out of habit than intention. But the gesture landed like a stone. Sophie noticed the croissant in her hand when she stepped out to a park bench, and she noticed later the envelope of a kindness that felt oddly tailored. A receipt and a scribble. For the bookshop, in a handwriting that could have been careful in a dozen languages. She didn't keep the receipt. She kept the feeling that someone had seen a small part of her life and acknowledged it without fanfare. There was a protection and distance that she valued. I am not of your world, she told herself. The bookstore that paid rent by the slimmest of margins with shelves of patched spines and handwritten recommendations was one small universe where she felt she could belong only if she worked quietly and kept her head down. Daniel's world had windows edged with glass and polished floors and donations to organizations that stood behind gleaming letters. The contrast was glaring. The newspaper article she would later find, meant to be a feature celebrating a clinic's outreach program, arrived like a verdict. A photograph of him at a gala, a caption mentioning his family fortune. The line between curiosity and assumption had been crossed in the headline's ink. She wished she could tell herself she didn't care. She could, for a minute, file the article under people who live differently, but the fear she carried felt older than money.
It had roots in Grandma's jokes about marrying up, in dates where men had made their wallets heavier than their interest, in the private tally she kept of how often she had been measured for value by the size of the ring someone imagined placing on her hand. To imagine Daniel stepping into her life felt like inviting a weather front across a fragile town. So she retreated. She stopped lingering at the cafe table. She declined to answer texts that were professional and thin. How are you feeling? Any new symptoms? Because even that small opening felt like an invitation, and invitations terrify her. Sometimes she replied with one-word answers that were honest in their smallness. Fine. Okay. When he left a paperback on the counter at the bookstore, folded into its spine a slip of paper with a sentence, "If you ever want to talk about anything other than books," she blinked until the letters amphibian into meaning. She put the book back on the shelf and told herself she had imagined the note. She told herself she had been foolish to feel caught by a kindness. Daniel noticed the distance. It stained his chest in a way he didn't like. He had never been good at letting things dissolve into silence. He once sent a patient a follow-up email because he couldn't stand the idea that a question would hang in the air unanswered. He had begun to imagine, in one of those brief pockets of private time that existed only in the edges of his schedule, that Sophie liked the small rituals of her life the way he liked the quiet of early clinics. He told himself to be patient. Ethical clarity can feel like coldness, he reasoned. It can protect both people, too. He kept his messages clinical. "How are you?" or "Let me know if anything changes." When she replied with clipped normalcy, he let it be. When she didn't reply at all, he sent nothing more. He wanted to be a doctor who didn't impose his presence for reasons that had nothing to do with her health. But he also found himself walking down the same block to the bakery more often than needed, just to see if the bell above the bookstore door would announce her passing. These small meetings multiplied. A glance in an aisle between new releases and discounted hardbacks, that left both of them feeling like they'd been recognized in a photograph. A quiet exchange over the price of a paperback when she gave him an extra bookmark because the register rounded down. A moment under the awning during a sudden downpour where they crouched in the same square of shelter until the sky relented. Each encounter was a pebble in a stream, tiny disturbances that nonetheless changed the flow. For Sophie, every sign of attention morphed into a litany of what-ifs. What if they assumed she was after something? What if her life, with its modest rent and quiet evenings in a tiny flat lined with stacks, read like a request for rescue to someone pre-trained to rescue?
In the silence of her kitchen, she would write unsent letters, short, halting things that admitted the truth of what she felt and then listed the reasons why it couldn't be real. Those letters lived in a shoebox in the back of a wardrobe, folded small and tight. She kept her bruises private. Before she had moved to the city, she had been taught to laugh off advantages, to correct compliments with a joke, to minimize need. The world rewarded people who could stand upright as if everything were okay. Sophie had the grace of being small in public. The private parts, her apprehension, the nights she cried because she had spent the last of her money on rent, were the parts she hid even from herself. Then, a week after the Café Croissant and the bookstore exchange, the article arrived on her phone with a headline that made her stomach twist. Renowned Dr. Daniel Hayes launches free women's health initiative. The piece was framed as praise. Daniel, it said, had pledged a portion of clinic proceeds to underserved neighborhoods. His mansion's renovation, his family's philanthropic partners, a photo of him at a charity ball with a glass raised. To anyone else, it was a profile in success. To Sophie, it read like proof. Undeniable, headline-sized proof that he was an island she could not swim to. She folded the screen face down and pretended not to see the light in the dark. The revelation sat on her like a weight. Her internal script ran through the possibilities until they formed a neat row. People liked to be seen as saviors. They liked stories about generosity. Generous men, generous clinics, were often hungry for adoration. She remembered the man who had once told her, without a trace of cruelty, that the nicest thing about him was that he had money to buy love. The memory hardened into a conviction she had learned not to contradict. Love offered by someone who could buy her life was not the same as love offered without material leverage. Around that time, Daniel began to notice the changes in her more clearly. She dithered when he arrived at the bookstore. Her laugh was thinner. Once, in the middle of a conversation about a 19th century poet, she blushed and excused herself, cheeks gone pale. He remained quiet. He wanted, impossibly perhaps, to reach across the small gap and say, "I'm not buying you anything you don't want." But he had trained himself to speak differently in these spaces. The line between concern and kindness was fine, and he refused to cross it without consent. He had reasons for caution. His past had taught him to be suspicious of motives shaped by the weight of his account statements. He had once loved someone who had found the scale of his wealth easier to count than the content of his days. The memory flared not as accusation, but as instruction. And yet, standing in a fluorescent bookstore light, watching Sophie tuck a stray hair behind her ear as if it were a secret, he felt something else, a sense of wanting to be uncalculated, to be seen not as provider, but as person. He made himself a quiet promise to move carefully. The promise contained both protection and desire. The weeks unfurled with that slow, merciless pressure that makes small things feel enormous. Sophie worked long days in a bookstore whose owner paid wages that scraped the bottom of dignity. She closed late, the store's lights flicking off in one by one until the space became an island. That evening, exhausted from standing, she walked home with 3 paperback novels tucked under her arm, a faint ache in her calf that tightened into a throbbing knot by the time she reached her street. She told herself to get more rest, to take a break, to eat better. She had told herself the same thing 100 nights ago. There was a day when everything ached. Her shift had been longer. The shop had been busy with holiday displays and people who smelled of layers. On the tube home, the colors of adverts blurred into one another, and she thought with distant alarm that the ceiling of the carriage was growing nearer. At a red light, she paused, swaying like a sapling in a winter storm. Her heart hammered, and she told herself to breathe. She had been dehydrated before. She knew the signs at the edges. The bag on her shoulder slid to the side. She gripped the strap. A pedestrian asked if she was all right. She offered a non-committal smile that felt like a brittle mask. She tried to walk again. Her vision spat out the edges, turning them into watercolor. The world narrowed to a pinpoint somewhere across the busy sidewalk. She tasted copper and lemon. Her knees failed. The pavement answered the rest. People around her reacted the way the city reacts. Hands raised from pockets, a chorus of, "Call an ambulance." The shout was thin with worry. Someone pressed a jacket under her head. The last thing she registered before the noise folded into the inside of a ringing, looped silence
was the coppery scent blooming into something blunter and clinical. Daniel had been days away at a clinic conference. He was walking back from his apartment when he saw the small cluster of people gathered like a question mark on the pavement. In the center of that human punctuation lay Sophie, her coat splayed, the crumpled paperback leaking its spine like an open wound. For a moment his mind arrested, recognition sharp as a blade. The cord of impulse pulled him forward. He pushed through bodies and kneeling to where she was, not as a doctor with a badge, but as a person whose earlier acquaintance had been unexpectedly profound.
His hands checked for pulse, breath, automatic, practiced. But when he rolled back the collar of her jacket to look for identity, his training reasserted itself, and he barked orders with the control that had steered him through emergency rooms and ward rounds. "Give her space. Someone help me get her on her side," he said, his voice low, and his hands followed the checklist burned into his muscles. The paramedics were rapid, professional. People moved away, giving the space that is an act of kindness in a crowded city. Daniel briefed the EMTs with clipped sentences. In the loud exchange, he kept pieces of himself measured, clinical phrases overshadowing the rest. He allowed only professional concern to swell aloud, though inside his chest something else clambered. Seeing her like that, the neat individuality of her hand clutching a bookmark, the ash of exhausted mascara, hurled a violent private reaction into him that wasn't about duty alone. "Has she been under a lot of stress?" one of the EMTs asked as they prepped a stretcher. "Possible dehydration and syncope," Daniel said. He spoke in probabilities. That was what doctors did to make the world manageable. But when he lifted his eyes and saw the thin lines of a paperback falling from her open palm, he felt an anchoring tenderness, an odd, uncompromising desire to stand witness to her fragility. He answered with a voice that was quieter than the one he'd used in the clinic. "She sells books. I saw her at the shop. She might have been skipping meals." The ambulance's siren threaded itself through city noise. People stepped back. The paramedics worked with the tidy choreography of practiced hands. Sophie, unconscious, looked smaller than she had in daylight, as if the city had been turned to a set, and someone had dimmed the lights on her when she wasn't paying attention. A nurse who had been in the clinic last week recognized Daniel and asked if he was affiliated with the hospital. "I can help," he said, a decision settling into his jaw. It was the right thing to do, and he was not going to hedge because the smallest thread of private feeling had tugged at him. He climbed into the ambulance and introduced himself as Daniel Hayes, physician. But as the slow jolt of siren and bearings took them into the arteries of the city, he kept the line between professional and personal taut and bright as wire. Inside the vehicle, he coordinated the initial care. He adjusted the IV, checked vitals, and recorded data. He did what needed to be done. And yet, as the ambulance threaded through traffic, his hands were not the easy, detached instruments of a man at a distance. They were precise, yes, but a different current ran beneath, the one that meant he knew the shape of her breaths in his body as if they were their own. At the hospital, he worked rapidly with the admitting team.
The scene became a series of small surgical motions, wheels over tiles, the bright clack of doors, the beep of monitors that translated life into numbers. He briefed nurses and the on-call doctor, then stepped back into the waiting area, because there, in the antiseptic, he needed a moment to locate himself. There was an attrition of thought that happens when you watch someone you know, if knowing is the right word, become a patient under fluorescent light. He thought about the thin line between caring and overstepping. In his head, a map of ethics and appropriateness sat like a library from which he withdrew a single volume at the moment. Keep boundaries. He understood the gravity of remaining a clinician first, a person second, until such a time when consent or discharge declared the latter permissible. Sometime later, the nurses informed him she was stable for now. They would keep her for observation. He had done his part in the emergency and had been listed in the chart, but then he was asked to step away until family or a next of kin could be contacted. There was no one. Sophie's wallet yielded a name in a handwriting that matched her booking, Sophie Bennett. No listed emergency contact. He left her file on a clipboard, the same small, humbling object that had accompanied her into the first clinic visit, and walked out into the corridor. Outside the observation room, between the hum of elevators and the soft buzz of vending machines, he felt the old, inconvenient pull. He sat on a bench and let himself think. He saw her again, in the cafe sunlight, in the bookstore aisles, fingers always moving. He felt guilt at the part of him that had been nothing but an observer in those weeks. He had been cautious for reasons that were not only professional, they were personal scars that didn't vanish because someone fainted on the sidewalk. The nurses asked him to step back. She was not his patient in the sense that her care was not under his sole management, but the hospital protocols left room for him to stay nearby as a concerned acquaintance. He accepted that space, balancing on the edge of professional propriety and something rawer. When the initial shock settled and the rhythm of the hospital redraws its boundaries, vitals stable, blood tests ordered, a promise of rest, the city outside kept breathing in different breath. Daniel sat and watched monitors through the glass door, the green lines making a staccato hymn that matched the flutter in his chest. He thought of the unsent letters he'd seen in private folders. The thought was not malicious. He simply wondered, with a professional curiosity that had become entangled in a personal knot, what made a person write things they never sent. Sophie slept with the small dark curl of her hair against her temple, like someone who had been living in two different skins until one finally folded in. The fluorescent light above softened strangely, lending the whole room a washed-out intimacy.
A nurse adjusted the blanket, pausing and then stepping back. Outside, Daniel folded his hands in his lap in a posture he had used since medical school when he wanted to feel as if he could still be purely useful. There are moments when being ethical requires not withholding care, but withholding language, he told himself, as if rehearsing for a scene, that this was one of those moments. He would not ask why she had hidden so much. He would not use the fact of her collapse as an opportunity to confess feelings he had not earned. The city had rules for things like dignity, and the hospital had rules that reinforced them. Yet beneath that resolve there was a simple, aching curiosity about the person who had fainted with a paperback in her hand, and who had, for reasons that were both small and absolute, made him feel noticed. He could not, he thought, offer the intimacy of comprehension in a way that would respect the circumstances, but he could at least sit and be present while she recovered. Presence, he told himself, is sometimes the purest form of attention. Outside, the city moved. On the bench in the corridor, he allowed himself a single soft transgression, a hand reaching into the pocket of his coat for a scrap of paper he'd torn from a journal, an almost private habit of recording tiny things that mattered. He scribbled a line and folded it down until it fit in the corner of his wallet, a small thing to put in order the part of him that had been tugged. Somewhere between the technologies of monitoring and the old human craft of watching someone breathe, the line between being a doctor and being a person thinned to mist. Daniel stood when a nurse approached, his fingers finding the strap of his bag. He felt a readiness to step back if asked, to stay if allowed. He had boundaries sharp as a scalpel, and a heart that sometimes refused to be wholly tunable. On the far side of the glass, Sophie slept without the armor she carried in daylight. Her face looked younger, less made up by the masks she had learned to wear. For all the reasons that had kept them apart, the rumor of wealth, the careful silences, both of them had arrived at a place where proximity had breached avoidance. No one spoke of the things that people feel on the edges of crisis. Inside the hospital, time was measured in small acts, an IV replaced, a nurse's soft-footed check, a monitor's steady beep. Outside in the corridor, the world made its quieter calculations, commitments to respect the line between interest and intrusion, promises to keep watch in a way that would not overstep. If you feel drawn to stories where two people find each other between the lines of ordinary days, stay with this channel. There are more quiet, true-to-life tales like Sophie and Daniel's. He waited in the corridor until someone with authority told him he must step back. It was a polite request, clinical and unadorned, but it landed like a weight.
He signed the note into the chart, assisting at scene, not primary caregiver, and watched nurses fold themselves into a rhythm that belonged to a place where feelings were usually cataloged as data points. Then he left the ward for the small coffee machine next to the staff room, because even a man taught to hold himself in compartments sometimes needed the steam of something ordinary to remind him he was still breathing. When he returned, he approached the observation room as a visitor. The distinction was a small, deliberate thing. He had taken off his clinic badge and draped his coat differently. He walked as if a patient might see him from a window and think him no different than any other concerned stranger. Ethical lines, he thought, could be observed in gestures as much as paperwork. Sophie was awake when he entered. The fluorescent glare had softened into something less interrogatory by afternoon. She was propped against pillows, a hospital blanket tucked around her knees in a way that made her seem like a child who had raided a linen closet for comfort. Her hair had loosened from whatever careful braid she'd worn at the shop, and for a heartbeat he saw the woman who laughed thinly in bookstore light, rather than the one who had collapsed on the sidewalk. Her eyes lifted, and for a moment she simply studied him as if deciding which version of him she had in front of her. Then something like a private smile threaded across her face, guarded, small. "You're still here," she said. "I came back to check," he answered. His voice was steady, the professional cadence still tucked around words, but there was an undercurrent that belied it. "You're stable. The team says you can go home with rest and fluids, and they'll follow up in a week."
She nodded. The motion was careful, as if even small gestures required thought. "I don't have anyone to call," she said. The words lodged in the space they had always occupied. Careful, diminishing. No emergency contact. He heard the practical fact and the loneliness braided together. For someone who had spent a lifetime saying little, she carried the quiet of absence with her. "I'll walk you downstairs if you'd like," he offered. It was a simple, non-intrusive kindness. He made sure the words were exactly that, an offer, not a demand. She hesitated, thumb worrying the edge of the blanket. "Only if you promise not to do anything odd," she said, and there was an attempt at humor in it that barely reached her eyes. "Please, no observations, no unsolicited advice." "I promise," he said, and meant it. He had studied the charts, briefed the team, and written the necessary lines to keep the professional record clean. He would not let the fact of his feelings become a wedge in that space. When they moved slowly down the corridor towards discharge, the hospital seemed to align itself around them. The antiseptic, the pale tiles, the mechanical rhythm of people doing their jobs.
Outside the automatic doors, the city aired itself in brief, hot currents. Sophie clutched a small paper bag with hospital discharge papers in one hand, the other curled protectively over a folded thing in the pocket of her cardigan. The weight of it made her wrist bend inward. They paused near the outpatient desk. She set the bag on her lap and folded her hands around the thing hidden in her pocket, as if it were something both precious and dangerous. The nurse who handed over paperwork was brisk and efficient. Daniel watched their exchange without intruding, a posture of respect that had been hard-borne. "You're clear for now," the nurse said. "Take it easy. Call if anything gets worse." Sophie managed a smile. "Thank you," she said. The phrase filtered through the small voice she used in public. Then, as if deciding on a course in private, she turned and looked at Daniel directly. There was a pause where 1,000 questions might have tried to crowd through. She unfolded her hands and brought out a tiny folded rectangle of paper. It was creased, edges soft from being refolded many times. His name, when he glimpsed the top corner, stared back at him in her own handwriting. To Daniel. For a second he felt the room compress. He had imagined this moment as a possibility. He had not imagined how the sight of his name on a scrap of paper, written by her, would lodge in him like a sudden, precise ache. The title of the story, something the world might later call dramatic, was small and private now. It was not a headline. It was an offering. "You can read it later," she said quickly, shame coloring the edges of the words. Only when you're not on duty. Only if you want. I didn't want to." Her voice thinned. The confidence she had wrapped herself in at the bookshop slipped for a moment, and something raw appeared. He stepped a fraction closer, and then stopped. He did not take the paper from her. Consent, in all its forms, had been a lesson hard learned. "Do you want me to read it now?" he asked. She chewed the inside of her cheek. "I want you to know why I backed away," she said finally. "I want you to know the truth. I couldn't say it loud. I wrote it instead. If you read it now, if you read it with me here, then it's not about the hospital. It's just 2 people, maybe." He nodded. The logic was simple and right. He had stepped away from the clinical role and paperwork and posture. He could not step away from the person he was. "Okay," he said, "if you want me to." She slid the folded paper to the side on her palm, like a card offered over a table. He took it gently, as he had taken a pulse or a chart, carefully, with fingers that wanted to be reverent. The paper smelled faintly of book glue and lemon soap, the small signatures of her life. He unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and slightly slanted, the loops of certain letters betraying the moments her hands had trembled. The note was short. 1 page, a paragraph, and then a few lines that seemed to have been added later, like pulses of confession. The first lines were as practical as everything she usually said. "I am writing this because saying it aloud makes me clumsy. Saying your name aloud makes me hot and stupid, and I forget how to breathe. I am not looking for help. I don't want your money." The paper seemed thinner when his eyes moved. He felt something in him tighten, the clarity of her fear framed like a shield. He kept reading. "I have been leaving letters in odd places," the next line said. "In books I thought you'd touch. In the croissant receipt you left folded like a tiny island in my pocket. In a shoebox at the back of my wardrobe. I write to you like a private practice, unsent, rehearsed, safe. I write when I am tired, and when the shop is quiet, and when the nights stretch long and mean. I write to remember a voice that isn't small." Her handwriting softened on the page. She had added a line beneath, indented,
like a footstep into more private ground. People have told me that men like you marry money, or they marry a version of themselves they can put on display, she wrote. My grandmother taught me to pretend the world wouldn't notice if I didn't take up too much space, so I learned to keep my needs folded small. If I stay small, no one will try to fix me. If I love quietly, if I never ask for a thing, I can belong. I was afraid you would see my life and think of it as a request. His throat constricted. The paper in his hands felt suddenly oversized, as if it held a map of things he'd only skimmed in glimpses. He understood with painful suddenness that her distance had not been disinterest, but a protective architecture. She had not wanted to appear as someone seeking purchase on his fortune. She had feared that affection would be measured in banknotes and in headlines. He kept reading. The last lines were the kind that made a chest unlock. I like you, she had written plainly. Not for the clinic ads, not for the way your name can make a headline. I like the way you look at a page when you are reading, the way you order black coffee, the small things you leave behind that are not grand gestures but breadcrumbs. I am terrified, yes, but I would rather risk being thought small than never tell you at all. If this shocks you, then at least it shocks you honestly. If it makes you walk away, then at least you walked away having known the truth. There was a small postscript beneath, in smaller writing, as if the act of saying everything had crept into extra sentences. I have kept your receipt and a page you once dog-eared. I sleep with letters I never send. If you read this, please don't pity me. Please don't make me into a charity. If you can like me for me, then put the paper back in my hand and say my name as if it doesn't scare you. Daniel's fingers folded the edges of the note as if to tuck its heat back inside.
The shock he felt was not of scandal or revelation. It was the stun of having been seen in a way he had not allowed himself to be seen, not as a wealthy man with endorsements and a platform, but as a person who had left small, human traces in her quiet life. The word that crowded into him was recognition, the discovery that someone he had barely known had been cataloging him in her private rituals, speaking to him in ink where speech felt dangerous. He looked at Sophie. Her face had a translucence to it now, made more fragile by the hospital light and by the fact that she had risked admitting to him her fear of being mistaken for a mercenary of advantage. I would never, he began, and then stopped because even the refusal sounded like a rehearsed defense. He did not want to be a man who said, I would never, as if that were a badge. He wanted to be a man who could mean less by proving more. He folded the paper with care and returned it to her. The sheet fit into her palm like something sacred. She tucked it into her cardigan and held it there with a gentleness he had not expected. Thank you, she said, and in that whisper there was some release, for listening, for not making a speech. He exhaled and let himself tell a truth he had kept under the same careful lid she had kept her letters behind. I have been afraid, he confessed, the words precise and honest. Not of you taking something from me, but of being taken for something I am not. I have been burned by being loved for statements on a balance sheet. I keep a lot of walls because they felt necessary. Seeing how you folded your life small, how you wrote me into it without loud bells. It makes me want to do something unwise. It makes me want to be smaller, honestly. She raised an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible question. Unwise is sometimes the only honest thing left, she said, and the humor in it landed like a soft landing. They left the hospital together with the paper still between them. Both had held it and both had learned what the other kept hidden. Outside, the air smelled like rain and exhaust, and was somehow more forgiving than the fluorescent corridor. The city had not paused for them, though it felt like it might have if they'd asked. In the days that followed, there were conversations that were both ordinary and monumentally important. Daniel checked in with a message that was explicitly not professional. No medical questions, no pretense. Just an offer to bring over a pot of soup or to meet for a proper cup of coffee at the cafe where they had first noticed one another. She accepted cautiously. Her acceptance was a small vote of trust, a test of whether his presence meant patronage or partnership. They established rules the way people learning to dance name the steps. Neither wanted to repeat old mistakes. He would not use his clinic's resources to smooth access in their lives.
He would not attend meetings about her care under the clinic's banner. When she needed medical follow-up, he would refer her to colleagues and wait for reports from them. She would not treat him like a charity or a project. They would both be careful. Carefully became the new language of their interactions. He would arrive at the bookstore and buy a coffee without comment, never making the purchase into a performance. She would hand him a book and say, "You might like this," and he would take it with the same humility a man takes an offered key. Their intimacy grew in small increments, shared errands, the private habit of exchanging notes folded into book pages rather than into a clinical record, the way he learned what kept her awake at night, and she learned that his guardedness had roots that predated her. He met, slowly, her friends and colleagues. She met his people too, those who were used to a life under a different kind of light. Each meeting was another step across the fragile bridge they were building. Sophie kept writing, but the letters changed. The unsent notes in her shoebox became letters she sometimes handed to him. Once, on a night when the rain argued with the city and everything outside was muffled, she gave him an envelope with nothing inside when he arrived. "I thought maybe," she began, and then let him finish with a quiet, "that if I could give you a paper and you could keep it, it would be less scary than saying things aloud." He read them like little archives of her days, the rare moments of joy, the irritation with a customer who misread a book, the small triumph of finally repairing a window display without the owner noticing the extra hour she had worked. He read about the nights she had been frugal to pay rent, about the jubilation of finding an old edition of a favorite novel buried under a stack of donations. The letters were a ledger of a life lived with fierce softness. For his part, Daniel learned how to show devotion in ways that did not diminish or erase her autonomy. He became the man who fixed a leaking pipe for the bookstore owner, rather than buying a new shop, the man who asked before he offered. He learned to accept scarcity as a fact of someone's life, without reflexively trying to substitute money for presence. He learned, too, how to sit with emptiness without filling it. They fought, like anyone. Small resentments about expectations surfaced. Once, after a day when the shop had been cruel and a patron had been thoughtless, she flinched at a kindness he made in public, his quiet offer to pay for a repair. "I don't need you to fix everything," she told him. "Sometimes I need you to believe I can." "I believe you can," he said. "I believe you. I don't know how to be helpful without shoving myself in, but I'm trying." "You don't have to make a grand gesture to prove it," she replied. "You can make me coffee every Tuesday."
You can let me teach you how to choose paperbacks without a medical journal in your pocket. He started buying the same croissant just because she liked the raisin swirl and left it for her on the corner table. She started to pick out novels for him that were not about medicine. In each small exchange, their history softened into habit. Months later, on a clear afternoon where the sun cut sharp lines on the pavement, Daniel took her back to the cafe. The table where he'd first seen her was free. The barista remembered them both and brought over 2 coffees with a smile that suggested the town had noticed as quietly as they tried to keep the thing private. For the first time since the hospital, the world seemed to hold a space that belonged to them. He leaned across the table and placed a small box in front of her. It was not extravagant, no headline-grabbing flourish, just a small navy case that fit easily in a palm. She looked at it as if it might be another kind of test. When she opened it, the ring inside was simple. A thin band, not ostentatious, set with a single tiny stone that caught the light like a punctuation mark. "I wasn't sure how to do this," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said in a long time. "I don't want to buy your life. I don't want to fix what isn't broken by giving you things. I want to do this because I have learned to be honest, because I have been lucky enough to spend time with you, because I want to choose you, every day. Not because it's easy, but because it's what matters." Her throat tightened. Her hands that had once clutched book spines and hospital blankets, trembled as she touched the metal. For a moment, she simply looked at him, and he looked back, both of them weighing the smallness and the courage of the gesture. "Do you mean—" she began. "I mean, will you marry me?" he finished. The sentence was simple and old as language, and somehow brand new in their mouths. She said yes, but not immediately. First, she folded her free hand over his in a way that made the barista's smile turn private. "I want to," she said. "But I also want us to keep being careful. I want us to keep writing letters that we hand to each other, not because we can't say the things aloud, but because we choose to keep some things sacred." He laughed softly, relief like warmth spreading through him. "I will write you letters," he promised, "and I will keep them in the same shoebox as yours if you like." They married in a small ceremony, a handful of friends, the owner of the bookstore who had been like a second family to Sophie, a nurse who had been on duty the day she fainted and who cried anyway because she loved a good love story. The setting was modest, a courtyard with string lights and a table of the same croissant from the cafe. No press, no gala, no social media announcement. They posed for photographs that captured them laughing between vows, and a moment of quiet as they read each other the notes they'd kept private for months. When people later asked about the paper she had once given him in the hospital, both of them laughed in the way of people who have lived through a small storm. It was not a dramatic bombshell, Sophie said. It was a truth handed over in paper. That was the only kind of drama either of us could stand. The years that followed did not erase the old anxieties. There were gray afternoons when Sophie would pull an unsent letter out and read it like a map of who she'd been. There were moments when Daniel's chest tightened at memory of past betrayal. But there was also a new pattern, the habit of speaking before assumptions grew roots, the practice of asking rather than assuming. They learned that a life together was less the smoothing of rough edges and more the willingness to show those edges and be held. One evening, years later, they sat in the cafe where it had all begun. He had a habit of folding a scrap of paper into his wallet, a note with her name on it, written in a hand that used to be clinical and now was soft. She picked up her coffee and said, "Do you ever think about how a little paper can change the course of things?" He looked at her as if the question had been written for him. "I do," he said, "but paper isn't magic. People are. It's the courage to put a thing down and offer it that makes the difference." She smiled, the look of a woman who had kept letters and worn courage as armor. "Then let's keep writing," she said, "and reading." If this story reached you and felt familiar, the ache of being small in a big world, the risk of offering yourself anyway, share it with someone who needs to hear that gentleness wins. If you'd like more quiet stories about people who find each other in ordinary places, like and subscribe. There's always another small, true tale waiting on this channel.